At my daughter's Christmas dinner, my son-in-law lifted his glass, looked me in the eye, and sneered, "You're nothing but uneducated trash." My daughter lowered her head and said nothing. Before I could answer, her father-in-law pointed at the front door and barked, "Get out, you low-class nobody." I quietly picked up the small gift I had brought, said nothing more than, "Okay, fine," and walked out into the cold. Minutes later, sitting alone in my old car, I made a single phone call. 3 days later, their perfect world began collapsing in ways they never imagined. Your presence here means more than you know. Tell me in the comments what country or city are you joining from today. Let's see how far this community reaches. Note this story includes fictional elements for entertainment and educational purposes. Names and settings are coincidental. The message, however, is one I hope stays with you. The invitation had been Camille's idea. She called me 3 weeks before Christmas, her voice carrying that particular brightness she only used when she wanted something to sound easier than it was. "Dad just come for dinner. It's the holidays. It'll be fine." I had heard those words before, "it'll be fine," and I had learned over many years of living quietly and watching carefully that people who said that phrase the most were usually the least prepared for when things weren't. But she was my daughter. So I ironed my good shirt, the navy one I kept folded in the back of my closet for occasions that required more than I naturally offered, and I drove my 2009 Buick LeSabre up the long private road that led to the Hargrove estate in Greenwich, Connecticut. The house was something out of a magazine that I would never have subscribed to. 4 columns flanked a front entrance wide enough to park 2 cars side by side. Every window blazed with warm amber light, and a 12-foot Christmas tree was visible through the main glass panel, decorated in gold and burgundy, not a single ornament out of place. I sat in the driveway for a moment, with my engine idling, and looked down at the small wrapped box on my passenger seat, a hand-carved wooden music box I had found at a craftsman's market in Litchfield. I had thought it was beautiful. Sitting in front of this house, I suddenly wasn't sure. I carried it inside anyway. The foyer smelled of pine and expensive candle wax. A woman I did not recognize took my coat with the practiced efficiency of hired help, and I stepped into a dining room that held 14 people I barely knew. Crystal glasses caught the candlelight. The table was set with china I was fairly certain cost more than my first car. Camille spotted me from across the room. She smiled, but it was the kind of smile that sits on the surface of a face without reaching anything deeper. She wore a dark green dress and diamond earrings I had never seen before, and for a half-second I searched her eyes for the girl who used to fall asleep in the truck on the way home from my shifts, her head against the window, her hair smelling like the cheap strawberry shampoo we bought in bulk. I didn't find her. "Dad." She crossed to me and kissed my cheek. "You made it." Said I would, I told her. Prescott Hargrove, my son-in-law, age 38, vice president of Hargrove Corp., a man who wore his confidence the way some men wear cologne too much, and in every room appeared at Camille's shoulder. He was tall, square-jawed, the kind of handsome that had probably never been told no often enough to build any real character. "Eugene." He shook my hand with 2 firm pumps, the greeting a man gives when he wants to signal dominance without saying anything outright. "Glad you could find the place. I had driven past this house 6 times in the last 2 years. I knew exactly where it was." "Wasn't too hard," I said. He turned before I could finish and steered Camille back toward the other guests, leaving me standing at the edge of the room with my wooden music box and my navy shirt that was, I noticed now, missing a button at the second from the bottom. I found a chair near the end of the table and introduced myself to the couple seated beside me. Bradford Whitfield, a broad-shouldered man in his mid-50s with silver hair and the ruddy complexion of someone who spent weekends on a sailboat, extended his hand. His wife Lorraine smiled with the careful warmth of a woman trained to be pleasant without being personal. They were Bradford explained without much prompting. Old family friends of the Hargroves' third generation Greenwich. Across the table sat Everett and Philomena Ashton, major investors in Hargrove Corp. Everett, with his reading glasses perched on his forehead, and Philomena in a fur-trimmed collar that probably cost 6 months of my old salary. Dinner began. The food was extraordinary. I ate quietly and listened. Prescott was holding court at his end of the table, his voice rising above the gentle clink of silverware with practiced ease. He told a story about a golf trip to Pebble Beach, and the table laughed on cue. He told another about a deal he had closed in London, and Everett Ashton nodded with the approval of a man whose money was tied to Prescott's continued success. Then Prescott looked down the length of the table at me. "You know," he said, his voice dropping into that register people use when they want an entire room to hear something while pretending it's a private remark. "Camille's father worked with his hands his whole life. Never really had much formal schooling. But he's very—" He paused, letting the pause do its work. "Authentic." Bradford Whitfield let out a short laugh. Lorraine pressed her lips together. Camille studied the centerpiece as though it were the most fascinating object she had ever encountered. My jaw tightened. I kept my fork moving. 30 minutes later, after the dessert plates were cleared, Prescott raised his glass and looked directly at me. There was no pretense left in his expression, no performance of politeness. His eyes were flat and certain, the way a man looks when he has decided he owns the room completely. "Here's to family," he said. Then lower aimed squarely at me, even the uneducated trash that wanders in from time to time. The table went rigid. Camille's hand moved slightly on the tablecloth, then stopped. Before I could respond, Reginald Hargrove Prescott's father, 65 years old, a man who had built his identity on the architecture of other people's deference, pushed back his chair and stood. He pointed one thick finger toward the front door, his face darkening with something past contempt. "Get out," he said. "You don't belong here. Get out of my son's house, you low-class nobody." Every face at the table turned toward me. I looked at Camille one final time. Her eyes were fixed on her dessert spoon. She did not look up. I set my napkin on the table, stood, and picked up the small wooden music box that nobody had asked about all evening. "Okay," I said quietly. "Fine." And I walked out into the cold. The cold hit me the moment the front door closed behind me. Not the sharp, aggressive cold of a storm moving in, but the quiet, settled cold of a December night that had been waiting patiently for everyone inside to stop pretending it wasn't there. Snow had been falling for the better part of an hour, and the Hargrove driveway, a long curved expanse of imported Belgian brick, was dusted white along its edges, the center still dark where the heat of the ground held on a little longer. I stood on the top step for a moment. My coat was still inside. I had not asked for it back. My hands were shaking, but not from the temperature. I gripped the wooden music box against my chest and walked to my car. The Buick sat at the far end of the driveway, well away from the clustered Mercedes and Range Rovers, as if it too understood it did not quite belong. I got in, pulled the door shut, and sat in the dark without starting the engine. Through the villa's tall front windows, I could see the warm amber glow of the dining room, the suggestion of movement, the faint outline of people returning to their conversations as though nothing had interrupted them. As though I had been no more significant than a draft from an open window, noticed briefly, then forgotten the moment someone closed the door. My chest ached in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. I had been called many things in my 67 years. Uneducated. Simple. A man who worked with his hands because he lacked the intelligence for anything else. I had heard those words in different mouths over a long lifetime, and I had learned to carry them without breaking. But hearing them come from Prescott's mouth in front of Camille, watching my daughter choose the pattern on a dessert spoon over her own father, that was a different kind of pain. That kind lived behind the sternum, low and persistent, like a coal that refused to go fully dark. I reached into the inside pocket of my jacket and pulled out my phone. The screen lit up the interior of the car with a pale blue glow. I scrolled to a contact I had not needed to use for several months. Solomon Brief. Solomon was 70 years old, a Yale law graduate, and the kind of attorney who had spent 4 decades being very quiet and very right. We had been friends since 1984, when we were both young men in New Haven. Him studying law at night, me hauling freight during the day, the two of us sharing a back booth at a diner on Wally Avenue, because it was warm and the coffee was cheap. He had built a practice in Midtown Manhattan that handled private equity restructuring and distressed debt acquisitions. In plain terms, Solomon's firm specialized in purchasing the bad debts of struggling companies at a discount, then using those creditor rights to legally compel repayment restructuring or full operational control. He was in every measurable sense the most dangerous man I knew, and also one of the very few people on earth I trusted without reservation. He picked up on the second ring. Eugene. His voice was even unhurried, the voice of a man who had been awake and ready. "How did it go?" "About how I expected," I said. A beat of quiet, then "They threw you out." Reginald pointed at the door. "Prescott called me uneducated trash in front of his guests." I paused. Camille didn't say a word. I heard Solomon exhale slowly, a long breath that carried the weight of a man who had spent 40 years watching people underestimate other people. "I'm sorry, Eugene. I mean that. I know you do." I looked out through the windshield at the snow gathering on the hood of the Buick. "Solomon, I need you to begin." A brief pause. "You're certain? Once I file the activation notice, the court order becomes effective within 48 hours. There's no quiet way to do this after that point." The legal mechanics behind that word belonged to a different evening 2 days earlier in Solomon's office on 6th Avenue, where all of this was first put into motion. What mattered now, sitting in that cold car outside the Hargrove estate, was the word itself. That word was simple. "Begin," I said. Solomon's voice shifted almost imperceptibly, a subtle drop in register, a sharpening of focus that I had heard exactly twice in 40 years of friendship. It meant he had moved from friend to attorney. "I'll file the emergency motion tonight. The judge on duty for holiday period filings is Honorable Warren Gould. I've appeared before him twice. He's precise and fast. We should have a signed order before morning." "Good." I finally started the car. The engine turned over with a low, familiar rumble. "Eugene." Solomon's voice came through the speaker, now filling the quiet interior. "Whatever happens next, you understand this goes all the way. There is no partial measure with what we're holding." My headlights came on and swept across the front face of the Hargrove villa. For just a moment, the light caught the tall front windows, illuminating the dining room in a pale wash from outside. I could see Prescott near the head of the table, glass raised, laughing at something. Reginald beside him, broad-shouldered and satisfied. And at the far edge of the frame, barely visible, Camille, her face turned slightly downward. "I know," I said. "That's exactly what I'm counting on." I turned the wheel and drove out into the snow. Behind me, the lights of the Hargrove estate grew smaller in my rearview mirror. And somewhere in a Manhattan office building, Solomon Brief was already reaching for the phone. To understand what I set in motion that night in the car, you need to go back 2 days to the afternoon of December 22nd, when I was sitting in a leather chair on the 34th floor of a building on 6th Avenue in Midtown Manhattan, watching the snow begin outside a floor-to-ceiling window and thinking about a freight yard in New Haven. That was where it started, not the plan, but the money. 41 years ago, I was 26 years old hauling industrial equipment on a loading dock for $11 an hour. The work was honest and it was hard and I was good at it, but I understood from the beginning that a man who only trades his body for wages will eventually run out of body. So I saved. Carefully. Obsessively. Every month I set aside what I could, And every year I looked for one small thing to put that money into: a storage facility in Hamden, a dry cleaning supply distributor in Waterbury, a minority stake in a small trucking company outside Hartford. Nothing spectacular, nothing that drew attention. Just patient, quiet accumulation over 4 decades, reinvesting returns, compounding slowly, letting time do what most people never give it the chance to do. By the time Camille married Prescott Hargrove 6 years ago, Callaway Capital Partners, my private investment fund, structured as a limited liability company and registered in Delaware, held assets valued at slightly over $90 million. Nobody knew that. Not Camille, not the Hargroves, not a single person at that Christmas table. I had kept it that way deliberately because I had watched wealth do ugly things to people who knew it was coming, and I did not want my daughter to become one of them. Solomon's office was exactly what you would expect from a man who had been practicing law for 40 years and had never once felt the need to impress anyone. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, a desk the size of a dining table, and a single framed photograph of him and his late wife on a fishing boat in Maine. No diplomas on the wall. No ego. Just work. He was standing at the window when I arrived, hands clasped behind his back, watching the street below. "The transfer cleared this morning," he said without turning around. $43,200,000. Callaway Capital Partners is now the sole holder of Hargrove Corp's consolidated defaulted debt. I settled into the chair across from his desk and let that number sit in the air for a moment. And the original creditors, all 3 signed. They were happy to get 60 cents on the dollar and walk away clean. Solomon finally turned from the window. His expression was composed, but his eyes carried the particular alertness of a man fully engaged. "Eugene, I want you to understand the position we're in now. Under Article 9 of the UCC, the Uniform Commercial Code, which is the federal framework governing secured lending in this country, as the new debt holder, we have legal standing to demand full repayment on the defaulted amount, request a formal audit of Hargrove Corp's financials, and petition the court to freeze the company's operating accounts if we have reasonable evidence that assets are being moved or concealed to avoid repayment. That last part is the important one." "And do we have that evidence?" I asked. Solomon walked to his desk and opened a manila folder. Inside were printed bank records, internal transfer logs, and what appeared to be a series of wire confirmations. "A source inside Hargrove Corp has been sending documents to my office anonymously for the past 6 weeks. We haven't confirmed who it is yet, but the materials are consistent and detailed. They show a pattern of funds being moved from Hargrove Corp's operating accounts into 2 offshore holding entities registered in the Cayman Islands. The amounts total approximately $9.4 million over 18 months. My stomach turned not from surprise but from the specific exhaustion of having suspected something and then being proven right. They were draining the company, systematically, Solomon said, and using the remaining assets as collateral for new loans they had no intention of repaying, including Eugene. He paused and looked at me directly. A proposed loan of $6.2 million that Prescott intended to secure using real estate assets held jointly in his and Camille's names. The leather chair suddenly felt very hard beneath me. He was going to put her house on the line, without her full understanding of the risk based on what we're seeing in these documents. Solomon closed the folder carefully. If that loan defaulted, and it would have given the state of the company's actual finances, Camille would have been legally liable for a significant portion of the debt. Her credit, her assets potentially, her personal financial standing for years. My hands pressed flat against my knees. My jaw tightened until I felt it in my temples. I had come into this room 2 months ago thinking about protecting a principal. Sitting here now, I realized I had also been protecting my daughter from something she did not even know was aimed at her. The office door opened, and Solomon's paralegal stepped in, sharp and precise. The kind of person who managed every document with the thoroughness of someone who understood that a single misfiled page could unravel years of careful work. She set a bound document on the desk in front of Solomon. "Emergency motion is ready for your signature," she said. Judge Gould's clerk confirmed he's available for holiday period filings through the 26th. Solomon picked up his pen and looked at me. "I'll hold this until you give me the word. Once I sign and file, there is no quiet exit from this process." I thought about the wooden music box on my passenger seat. I thought about Camille's voice on the phone 3 weeks ago, "It'll be fine." I thought about a loading dock in New Haven and 40 years of patience. "Hold it until Christmas Eve," I said. "I want to look them in the eye first." Solomon signed the motion and handed it across the desk without another word. Outside the window, the snow over Manhattan was falling steadily now, covering everything in a clean, impartial white, the kind that made the whole city look just briefly like it could start over. I had other plans. I spent Christmas Day alone at the Mayflower Inn in Washington, Connecticut. It is a quiet place, a 19th century property set back from the road behind old maple trees, the kind of hotel that smells of wood polish and dried lavender, and does not put televisions in the common rooms. I had stayed there twice before over the years, both times when I needed to think without interruption. The staff knew me as a modest, soft-spoken guest who tipped generously and asked for nothing except strong coffee and to be left in peace. I ordered breakfast in my room on Christmas morning, sat by the window, watching the snow over the garden, and did not call anyone. Not Camille. Not Solomon. I simply sat with what had happened and let it settle the way sediment settles to the bottom of still water when you stop stirring it. By the morning of December 26th, I was ready. Solomon's office in Midtown was quieter than usual between the holidays, the building half emptied by staff, taking extended time with their families. He met me in his conference room with 2 cups of coffee and a legal pad filled with handwritten notes. And he got directly to the point, the way he always did, without preamble, without softening, because he respected me enough not to. "She came in yesterday morning," he said. "Harriet Wynne. She's been the one sending us the documents." I leaned forward. "You confirmed it." She confirmed it herself. Walked in at 9 a.m. on Christmas Day. She had learned through a mutual contact what happened at the Hargrove dinner the previous evening, and she told him that the moment she heard what happened at that Christmas dinner, she decided the time for anonymity was over. She had waited 6 weeks to see if the right person was on the other end of those documents. Christmas Eve gave her the answer. Solomon turned his legal pad to face me. Harriet Wynne, 41 years old. She worked as a senior financial analyst inside Hargrove Corp. for 4 years before she was abruptly terminated 8 months ago. No stated cause, no severance beyond the legal minimum. She filed a wrongful termination complaint with the Connecticut Department of Labor, which went nowhere because Hargrove Corp's attorneys buried it in procedural delays. Why was she really let go, I asked. Because she started asking questions about the Cayman transfers. Solomon tapped the legal pad. She noticed the discrepancies in the quarterly reconciliation reports, money going out that didn't match any legitimate vendor or operational expense. When she flagged it to the CFO, she was told it was above her clearance level. When she flagged it a second time in writing, she was terminated within 2 weeks. My coffee cup was warm in both hands, and she kept the records. She kept everything. Solomon allowed himself the smallest trace of satisfaction. Printed copies, digital backups on a personal drive, and a series of emails she sent to her own private address before her company access was revoked. Under the Federal Whistleblower Protection Act and applicable Connecticut employment statutes, which protect employees who report financial misconduct and face retaliation as a result, Harriet qualifies for full legal protection. Solomon's filing also cited relevant provisions under the False Claims Act, given that the nonprofit involved had received federal housing assistance funds. That means she cannot be sued, threatened, or retaliated against for the information she has provided. My firm filed her protection notice yesterday afternoon. I exhaled slowly. Is she frightened? Solomon set down his pen. She's one of the steadiest people I have met in a very long time. But yes, she's frightened. He looked at me carefully. Eugene, there is something else about Harriet that you need to know, and I want to tell you now rather than have it surface later. I met his eyes. Tell me. Her full name before she reverted to her birth name 8 months ago was Harriet Hargrove. Solomon let that land before he continued. She was married for 3 years to Donovan Hargrove Prescott's older brother. The marriage ended when Reginald Hargrove used his attorneys to systematically dismantle her financial standing during the divorce proceedings, leaving her with no settlement and significant legal debt. Donovan did not oppose his father's actions. He simply watched. The conference room felt very still. Outside the window, the gray December sky pressed low over the Manhattan skyline. She has been carrying this for 5 years, I said. It was not a question. 5 years. Solomon nodded. She didn't come to us out of nowhere, Eugene. She found our firm because she traced the debt acquisition back to Callaway Capital Partners, and she traced Callaway Capital Partners back to you. She knew you were Camille's father. She decided you were the right person to give this to. Something moved in my chest that I did not have an immediate word for the particular weight of realizing that another person had suffered in the same architecture of cruelty that your own family had built and had chosen to trust you with the evidence of it. I want to meet her, I said. I expected you would. I've arranged for you to meet at Bushnell Park in Hartford the day after tomorrow. Public enough to be safe, private enough for an honest conversation. Solomon picked up his pen again. There is one more thing from her files that I need to walk you through today, because it directly affects the next step in our legal process. He opened a second folder thicker than the first, the pages dense with figures and account numbers, and slid it across the table toward me. Harriet's records show a third account, he said, beyond the 2 Cayman entities we already identified. This one is connected to a community fund administered through a church in New Canaan. The fund was established for low-income housing assistance. Over the past 14 months, approximately $3.8 million has been redirected out of that fund and into Hargrove Corp's operational accounts to cover cash flow shortfalls. My hands went very still on the folder. They took money from a church fund, I said. My voice came out quieter than I intended, pressed flat by something between fury and disbelief. From families who needed it, Solomon said. Yes. I stared at the account numbers on the page in front of me without really seeing them. I had come into this process with a clear and rational plan. But sitting in that conference room on the 26th of December with a folder full of stolen money and a woman's 5 years of quiet suffering sitting across the table, I understood something I had not fully understood before. This was no longer only about me, and somewhere across the city, Prescott Hargrove was waking up to the first morning of the rest of his life still completely unaware of what was already moving toward him. Solomon called me at 7:43 in the morning on December 27th. I was still in my room at the Mayflower Inn, sitting at the small writing desk near the window, with a cup of coffee that had gone lukewarm, reviewing the folder of documents Harriet had provided. When the phone rang and I saw Solomon's name on the screen, I picked up before the second ring. It happened, he said. I set the folder down. Tell me. Judge Gould signed the emergency order at 6:15 this morning. By 7 a.m., the freeze was in effect. Solomon's voice carried the measured steadiness of a man delivering news he had spent weeks preparing for. But even he could not entirely suppress the current of satisfaction running beneath it. Hargrove Corp's 3 primary operating accounts at First Northeastern Bank in Stamford are frozen as of this moment. No withdrawals, no transfers, no new debt instruments can be executed until the court lifts the order or the matter is resolved. I want to make sure that is clear because it matters enormously to everything that follows. An emergency account freeze, technically called a prejudgment attachment order under Connecticut state law, is a court-issued directive that locks a company's bank accounts in place while a legal claim is being investigated. It is not a criminal action at this stage. It is a civil creditor protection measure, meaning that I, as the legal holder of Hargrove Corp's defaulted debt, had the right to ask a judge to prevent the company from draining its accounts and leaving nothing to repay me with. Judge Gould, reviewing Solomon's motion and the supporting evidence of the Cayman transfers, agreed there was sufficient cause. The freeze was entirely lawful, precisely targeted, and effective immediately. How did they find out? I asked. The bank is required by law to notify the account holder within 2 hours of a freeze order being executed, Solomon said. Their CFO, a man named Gerald Pruitt, who has been with the company for 9 years, called Prescott's cell phone at 7:20. I have a contact at the bank who confirmed the notification went through. After that, it apparently took Prescott approximately 8 minutes to arrive at the Stamford office, which is either impressive or tells you exactly how close he lives to his own building. Despite everything, I felt the corner of my mouth move. What happened when he got there? Gerald Pruitt described it to my contact as, Solomon paused, and I could hear the faint rustle of notes, quote, the most frightened he had ever seen a man in a suit behave. He cleared his throat. Prescott apparently demanded that the bank manager be reached, directly insisted the freeze was a clerical error, and when he was told it was a court-issued order and not negotiable, he put his fist through a partition wall in the conference room. I said nothing for a moment. I looked out the window at the bare winter garden of the Mayflower Inn, the snow-covered hedges and the gray morning sky, and I breathed in slowly through my nose. Eugene. Solomon's voice shifted. He then demanded to see the creditor documentation. The name on the filing is Callaway Capital Partners, LLC. Gerald Pruitt read it to him directly. And, Pruitt said. Prescott went very quiet. Asked him to repeat it. Then asked who Callaway was. A pause. Pruitt told him it was a private investment fund. He didn't have further details on file. But Eugene Prescott is not a stupid man. He will connect that name to you. It may take him a few hours, or it may take him until tomorrow, but he will get there. I picked up my coffee cup, found it cold, and set it back down. Let him. Are you sure you want to be reachable when he does? I want to be very reachable, I said. I want him to call me. I want to hear exactly what he says when he understands who he is dealing with. Solomon took a breath. There is one more development from this morning that you need to hear. When Prescott left the Stamford office, he made 2 phone calls from the parking garage. His assistant overheard the first one. He called Reginald. What did he say? He said, Solomon read carefully from his notes. Dad, something is wrong. The accounts are locked, and I don't know who is behind it yet, but I need you to call Montgomery at the bank and fix this today. Then he apparently stopped speaking, listened for a moment, and said, No, I don't think it's the Ashtons. This is someone else. Someone I don't recognize yet. Someone I don't recognize yet. I repeated that sentence in my mind twice. There was something almost tender about it, the absolute certainty with which a man like Prescott Hargrove moved through the world, the unshakable confidence that he knew every player in every room, and the first hairline fracture in that certainty appearing on a cold December morning in a parking garage in Stamford. He had looked at me across his Christmas dinner table 2 nights ago and seen nothing worth remembering. A man in a navy shirt with a missing button carrying a wooden music box that nobody asked about. Background furniture in the story of his own success. Solomon. I said, make sure the documentation for the Cayman account transfers is filed with the court by end of day. I want the legal record complete before he figures out who I am. Already in process, Solomon said. Laura is filing the supplemental exhibits at noon. Good. I finally stood up from the writing desk and moved to the window looking out at the pale winter morning. And the meeting with Harriet is still set for tomorrow. Bushnell Park, Hartford, 10 a.m. Then I'll be there. I pressed my hand flat against the cold glass of the window for a moment, feeling the chill against my palm. Solomon, one more thing. Prescott said he didn't think it was the Ashtons, which means Everett Ashton is already nervous enough that Prescott considers him a suspect. A beat of quiet. Then Solomon said very carefully, "That is a very interesting observation." "Isn't it?" I said. I ended the call and stood at the window for a long moment, watching the bare branches of the maple trees in the garden move slightly in the wind. $43 million had just locked every door that Prescott Hargrove thought he owned, and he still did not know the man who held the key. But by tomorrow he would know the name. What he would do with that knowledge was the question that kept me standing at that window far longer than the cold morning warranted. He called at 2:17 in the afternoon. I was sitting in the lobby of the Mayflower Inn reading a 2-day-old copy of the Hartford Courant when my phone buzzed on the side table beside me. The screen read, Prescott Hargrove. I had not saved his number. I never had, but I recognized it because Solomon had forwarded it to me that morning, along with a single line of text, "He will call. Be ready." I let it ring 4 times. Then I answered, "Eugene." His voice was tight-clipped, stripped entirely of the easy confidence that had filled his dining room 2 nights ago. The difference was startling, the way a sail looks startling when the wind drops out of it suddenly, all that billowing authority gone flat in an instant. "I need to talk to you." "You're talking to me now," I said, a sharp exhale. "Don't do that. Don't be cute about this." I heard movement in the background, the sound of hard-soled shoes on a marble floor, a door closing. He had stepped away from someone. I spent the last 4 hours going through every piece of documentation attached to that court order. Callaway Capital Partners. That's you. That's your fund. "It is," I said. The pause that followed was not brief. It was the kind of pause that happens when a man's entire framework of the world requires sudden and violent reassembly. I had been in Prescott Hargrove's understanding of reality, a 67-year-old man with a worn coat, an old Buick, and no meaningful place in any conversation that mattered. Callaway. Capital Partners, LC, a Delaware-registered private investment fund holding $43 million in distressed debt, and a court-issued freeze order on his company's operating accounts, did not fit inside that understanding. Not even close. "How?" he finally said, and the word came out less like a question and more like something torn. "Carefully," I said, "and over a very long time. Eugene." His voice cracked slightly at the edge, then hardened again immediately, the way a man hardens when he realizes he has shown something he did not mean to. "Listen to me. Whatever this is, whatever you think you're doing, we can sit down and resolve this. I can have our attorneys draft a repayment structure within the week. Nobody needs to involve the courts further. Nobody needs to make this Prescott." I kept my voice level, unhurried, the same voice I had used for 40 years on loading docks and in boardrooms and in every quiet room where someone had underestimated what I was capable of. 2 nights ago, you raised a glass in your dining room and called me uneducated trash. In front of your guests, your investors, and my daughter. I paused. Your father pointed at the door and told me to get out of the house. Silence pressed through the phone line like something physical. "I am not interested in a repayment structure," I said. "The court will manage that process from here." "You can't be serious." His voice climbed now, the composure fraying at the edges. "You're doing this over a dinner, over words said at a party, Eugene. That's insane. That's not how adults handle." "I'm not doing this over dinner," I said, and I let a quietness into my voice that stopped him mid-sentence. "I'm doing this because you have been using my daughter's name on legal documents to protect assets that don't belong to her, because you have been moving company funds into offshore accounts to avoid your creditors, and because a woman named Harriet Wynne lost her career for noticing what you were doing and having the integrity to say so. I let that sit for exactly 3 seconds. The dinner was simply the moment I decided to stop waiting. I heard his breathing change faster, shallower, the breathing of a man whose chest is tightening against his will. Solomon had told me earlier that afternoon what had unfolded at the Hargrove mansion before Prescott made this call. Reginald had gathered the household Prescott Constance and the company's personal attorney, a man named Gerald Fitch, who had been on Hargrove retainer for 20 years, in the main study to review the court documentation. Constance Hargrove, Reginald's wife of 35 years, a composed and carefully presented woman who had spent 3 decades perfecting the art of being decorative and unreadable, had sat in a wingback chair near the window and said almost nothing during the entire 2-hour meeting. Almost nothing. But according to Fitch's assistant, who had reasons of her own to be forthcoming with Solomon's office, Constance had asked one very specific question when the name Callaway Capital Partners appeared on the freeze order. She had asked, "How much does he know? Not who is this person? Not how do we fight this?" She had asked how much I knew, which meant Constance Hargrove already understood with perfect clarity what there was to know. I filed that away and said nothing to Prescott about it. "This is not over," Prescott said into the phone. His voice had dropped to something low and controlled, which told me the panic had passed its first peak, and he was now calculating. A calculating Prescott was more dangerous than a panicking one, and I respected that enough to note it. My father has relationships in this state that go back 40 years. Legal, financial, political. You think a court order from a holiday period filing is going to hold against that? "I think Judge Warren Gould signs his orders very carefully," I said. "And I think $43 million in documented defaulted debt, combined with $9.4 million in verified offshore transfers, is going to hold just fine." Another silence. Then very quietly, "Where did you get those numbers?" "Good night, Prescott," I said, and I ended the call. I set the phone face down on the side table and looked out through the lobby windows at the darkening afternoon, the sky going the deep pewter gray of a New England winter evening. My hands were completely steady. My heart rate, as best I could tell, had not moved. Somewhere across the state, in a mansion in Greenwich, a family was beginning to understand that the man they had dismissed as furniture was the one holding the deed. And in a wingback chair by a window, a woman named Constance Hargrove was asking questions that told me she was not going to wait for her husband to save her. Bushnell Park in Hartford is beautiful in summer, all open lawns and carousel music, and children running between the old elm trees. In late December, it is something else entirely, spare and stripped back. The trees bare, the fountain turned off for winter, the paths dusted with the kind of granular frost that crunches faintly under your shoes and makes every footstep feel deliberate. I arrived 10 minutes early and sat on a bench near the carousel pavilion, with my coat buttoned to the collar and my hands wrapped around a paper cup of coffee I had picked up on the way. The park was nearly empty. A woman walked a dog along the far path. 2 joggers passed without looking up. The sky above Hartford was the pale, washed-out white of a winter morning that had not decided yet whether to give more snow. Harriet Wynne arrived exactly at 10. She was not what I had constructed in my mind from Solomon's description. I had imagined someone diminished, a woman ground down by 5 years of legal battles and financial wreckage, moving carefully through the world to avoid attracting further damage. What I saw instead was a woman of 41 who walked with her chin level and her shoulders straight, dressed in a dark wool coat and low boots, her dark brown hair pulled back simply. Her face was composed and precise, the face of someone who had made a private decision a long time ago and had been living steadily inside that decision ever since. She spotted me, walked directly to the bench, and sat down without preamble. "Mr. Calloway," she said. Her voice was measured clear, the kind of voice that had learned to carry weight without trembling under it. "Eugene," I told her. "Please." She nodded once. "Eugene." She looked at me for a moment, with the particular directness of someone who has spent years reading people for signs of reliability. Whatever she found, it seemed to satisfy her. "Solomon told me you wanted to hear it from me directly." "I did," I said. "Not the documents. I have the documents. I wanted to hear what the documents can't tell me." Something shifted in her expression, not breaking, but opening slightly, the way a window opens a fraction, to let air in without letting the weather through. She wrapped both hands around her own cup of coffee and looked out at the empty fountain across the path. "I met Donovan Hargrove at a conference in Boston 11 years ago," she began. "He was charming and attentive and said all the right things. We got married 18 months later. I thought I understood what I was walking into." She paused. "I didn't understand anything." "Donovan Hargrove," she explained, "was Prescott's older brother by 4 years, 42 years old. Now quiet, where Prescott was loud. Methodical, where Prescott was impulsive, but no less shaped by Reginald's architecture of control and entitlement. He had worked inside Hargrove Corp for 12 years, in a senior operations role, occupying the part of the company that nobody celebrated publicly, but everybody depended on quietly. "The marriage was difficult from the beginning," Harriet said. "Reginald ran the family the way he ran the company. Every decision cleared through him. Every holiday, every financial choice, every social appearance. Donovan didn't push back. He never pushed back against his father. Not once." She took a breath. "When I filed for divorce after 3 years, I believed I was simply ending something that wasn't working. I did not understand that Reginald would treat my leaving as an act of aggression against the family name." Her voice stayed steady, but her hands tightened almost imperceptibly around her coffee cup. "Reginald hired 4 attorneys," she continued. "They challenged every asset disputed, every financial record from our marriage, and filed 3 separate motions designed not to win in court, but to exhaust my resources before anything reached a judge. My own attorney told me after 14 months that I had 2 choices: accept nothing and keep fighting until I was personally bankrupt, or accept their settlement offer, which was—" She stopped, and for the first time something moved behind her eyes that she did not entirely control. "Nothing. No share of marital assets, no legal fee recovery, nothing. Because by that point I had nothing left to fight with. And Donovan," I said carefully, "during all of that," she looked at me directly. "He sent me an email. One email after the settlement was signed. It said, 'I hope you find peace. This was the right outcome for everyone.'" Her jaw tightened. He meant for everyone in the Hargrove family. I felt something move through my chest, a slow, deep anger, the kind that does not flare and burn, but rather settles in and stays heavy and permanent. I thought about my daughter. I thought about what Camille had chosen, or thought she was choosing when she married into that family. I thought about what she had not been told. "You took the job at Hargrove Corp after the divorce," I said. 8 months after, under my birth name. Hargrove Corp is a large enough company that not everyone knows everyone, and I had changed my appearance enough. A small dry turn of her mouth that was not quite a smile, that the people who might have recognized me didn't. I told myself I was simply taking a job that used my skills. That was partly true. She met my eyes. The other part was that I needed to understand what I had been destroyed to protect. And when I found it, when I found what they were actually doing with the company's money, I understood that what happened to me was not personal spite. It was pattern. Anyone who got too close to the truth got removed. So you started sending documents to Solomon? To Solomon's firm, yes. I didn't know who was on the other end. I only knew the firm had a reputation for distressed debt work and financial litigation, and that if someone was going to use those documents effectively, it would require that specific kind of legal expertise. She looked at me steadily. I didn't know about you, Eugene. Not until Solomon told me who his client was, and then I understood why it had to be you. I looked at her for a long moment. The frost on the path between us caught the pale winter light, and somewhere behind the bare trees a bird called once and went quiet. Harriet, I said, what they did to you, the divorce, the attorneys, all of it, that is going to be part of the record. Solomon will make sure of it. For the first time, her composure cracked, not dramatically, not with tears, but with the slight involuntary tremor of a person who has been carrying something very heavy for a very long time, and has just been offered for the first time the possibility of setting it down. Thank you, she said. Her voice was barely above the sound of the frost under our shoes. We sat for a while longer in the quiet park, two people who had been damaged by the same family in different ways, watching the pale winter sky over Hartford hold its breath. I did not yet know that by the time we stood up from that bench, Reginald Hargrove had already decided on his next move, and it would be the worst decision he had ever made. Solomon called me as I was driving back from Hartford. Reginald Hargrove wants a meeting, he said. Today. He contacted Gerald Fitch, the family's personal attorney. 20-year retainer, handles everything from estate planning to the kind of quiet legal work that doesn't get filed in public record. And Fitch reached out to my office an hour ago requesting an emergency sit-down. Reginald wants to come to you. He's proposing the Mayflower Inn. I kept both hands on the wheel and watched the winter road unspool ahead of me through the bare Connecticut countryside. He found out where I'm staying, in Pone. He has resources, Solomon said simply. Do you want to take the meeting? I thought about it for exactly 4 seconds. Yes. Tell Fitch 3 o'clock. My terms Reginald comes alone. No Prescott. Fitch can attend as his counsel, but he does not speak unless I ask him a direct question. Solomon paused. Eugene, you understand that anything said in this meeting... I'm not negotiating, I said. I want to look at him. There's a difference. There was a brief quiet on the line. Then Solomon said, I'll be there at 2:30. Don't start without me. They arrived at 3 o'clock precisely, which told me Reginald Hargrove was the kind of man who understood that arriving late to a meeting you requested is a sign of weakness you cannot afford. I was seated in a small private sitting room off the main lobby that the inn manager, a courteous man named Walter Foss, who had arranged it without asking unnecessary questions, had set aside for us. Solomon sat to my left, a legal pad open in front of him, his reading glasses on his expression, giving away absolutely nothing. Reginald walked in ahead of his attorney, seeing him here away from the architecture of his own home, the marble floors and the 12-foot Christmas tree, and the dining table full of people whose deference he had purchased over decades. He was still a large, broad-shouldered man, with the bearing of someone accustomed to being the most significant presence in any room. But something had shifted in the quality of that bearing overnight. The absolute certainty was still there in his posture, but behind his eyes there was something new, something that moved and recalculated and did not quite settle. He recognized it himself, I think, because the first thing he did when he sat down across from me was smooth the front of his jacket, with both hands a small, almost involuntary gesture that told me more than anything he was going to say. Gerald Fitch, his attorney, was a compact man in his early 60s with a silver tie and the practiced neutrality of someone who had spent his career navigating other people's disasters without catching any of the debris himself. He sat beside Reginald and opened his own portfolio without looking at either Solomon or me. Eugene. Reginald's voice was deep, deliberate, calibrated to authority, but it lacked the contempt that had driven it on Christmas Eve. Contempt requires confidence, and confidence requires certainty, and Reginald's certainty had been taking hits for 36 hours. I think we can agree that this situation has escalated beyond what either of us intended. I intended exactly what has happened, I said. His jaw tightened. A vein along his temple moved. I'm prepared to discuss a structured resolution. Hargrove Corp can begin repayment proceedings within 30 days. We have assets that can be liquidated to cover a significant portion of the outstanding debt, and Gerald has drafted a preliminary framework. Reginald. I said his name the way you set something heavy down on a table, not loudly, but with enough weight that it stops the conversation around it. I did not take this meeting to negotiate a repayment schedule. The court will oversee the repayment process. That is what courts are for. He stared at me. His nostrils flared once. Then why are we here? Because you asked to be, I said. And I wanted to give you the opportunity to say whatever you came to say face to face. The same courtesy you declined to extend to me on Christmas Eve. The sitting room was very quiet. A fire burned low in the small grate against the far wall, and outside the windows, the afternoon light was already thinning toward the short darkness of a December day in New England. Reginald leaned forward, and his voice dropped to something that was supposed to be intimidating, but landed closer to desperate. I have built this state around me, Eugene. Every institution, every courtroom, every back room where decisions actually get made, I have been in all of them for 4 decades. You think one holiday court order survives that kind of infrastructure? I can bury Callaway Capital Partners in audits and counterfilings until your legal fees alone become a reason to walk away. Solomon looked up from his legal pad for the first time. He removed his reading glasses, folded them carefully, and placed them on the table. He looked at Reginald with the expression of a man who has heard that particular speech approximately 200 times in 40 years, and has watched it fail every single one of those times. Mr. Hargrove, Solomon said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who does not need volume to be heard. Callaway Capital Partners holds $43 million in documented defaulted debt, supported by verified offshore transfer records, totaling $9.4 million, a court-issued freeze order signed by a federal judge, and the sworn testimony of a protected whistleblower. A counterfiling strategy against that evidentiary foundation would require your attorneys to work very hard for a very long time to accomplish very little. He paused. But you are welcome to try. Reginald sat back. His hands, I noticed, were pressed flat against his thighs, the posture of a man physically restraining his own reaction. Gerald Fitch leaned toward his client and murmured something. Reginald gave a short, sharp shake of his head. Then he looked at me. Not with contempt this time, not with the easy dismissal of Christmas Eve. He looked at me the way a man looks at something he has badly and irreversibly miscalculated. "What do you want?" he said. And for the first time, the question was genuine. I reached into the breast pocket of my jacket and placed a single item on the table between us. It was a printed photograph taken at his Christmas dinner by one of his own guests and shared on a private social media account that his family had not thought to restrict. It showed Reginald standing at the head of his dining table, one thick finger pointed at the door, his face dark with fury. The man in the photograph looked like exactly what he was. "I want the court to decide what you want," I said. "I'll see you there." I stood. Solomon rose beside me. Gerald Fitch was already reaching for his phone. Reginald did not move. He sat at the table in the quiet sitting room of the Mayflower Inn and stared at the photograph, and whatever he was feeling in that moment, I did not need to name it to know it was the right thing for him to feel. I walked out into the corridor and kept walking. Something told me that tonight alone in that mansion in Greenwich, Constance Hargrove was going to make a decision that would change everything. Before I reveal what Constance had been hiding inside that mansion for 35 years, comment the word waiting, so I know you are still here with me. And a gentle note. The story continuing from here carries some fictional elements woven in for depth and reflection. If that is not something you want, this is a perfectly good moment to step away, no hard feelings at all. She did not go through Solomon. That was the first thing that surprised me. I had half expected Constance Hargrove to make contact through attorneys carefully formally, with enough legal insulation between herself and the act of reaching out that it could never be characterized as voluntary cooperation. Instead, at 8:14 on the morning of December 29th, my personal cell phone rang with a number I did not recognize, and when I answered, her voice came through with the unhurried precision of a woman who had rehearsed what she was going to say and had decided at the last moment to discard the rehearsal entirely. "Mr. Calloway," she said, "this is Constance Hargrove. I would like to meet with you today, without attorneys, without Reginald knowing." I stood very still in the middle of my hotel room. Outside the window, the morning was gray and dense, the kind of winter sky that presses down close to the earth and makes the world feel smaller than it is. "How did you get this number?" I asked. "My husband had your contact information pulled 2 days ago," she said. "He left the file on his desk. He does not know I looked at it." A pause. "He does not notice many things I do, Mr. Calloway. He never has." I told her I would meet her. She suggested a small cafe in New Canaan, a town 15 minutes from Greenwich, far enough from the Hargrove social circle to be safe close enough that she could be there and back before Reginald asked any questions. I called Solomon immediately after and told him what was happening. He told me to go to keep my phone recording and to let her lead the conversation. "Do not offer her anything," he said. "Not immunity, not protection, not promises of any kind. Only listen. Whatever she gives you, she has to give freely." The cafe was quiet at mid-morning. 2 other tables occupied by people absorbed in laptops and their own concerns. Constance was already seated when I arrived. Up close, away from the formal staging of the Christmas dinner, she was a striking woman, 62 years old, silver-haired, dressed with the understated precision of someone for whom appearance had always been a form of armor. But her hands wrapped around a ceramic mug on the table told a different story. Her knuckles were white. "Thank you for coming," she said. "Thank you for calling," I said and sat down across from her. She looked at me for a long moment. Her eyes were a pale, clear gray, and they carried in them the particular exhaustion of a person who has been performing a role for so long that they have almost forgotten there was ever anything underneath it. "I have been married to Reginald Hargrove for 35 years, she began. Her voice was controlled, but the control had a cost I could hear in every word. "In that time, I have watched him build something that looked from the outside like a family. A successful one. A respectable one." She looked down at her mug. "From the inside, it was a set of arrangements. Everything was arranged what we said in public, what we did not say in private, who was brought close and who was removed when they became inconvenient." "Harriet Wynne," I said quietly. Her jaw tightened. "Among others, yes." She looked up. I liked Harriet. She was honest and capable, and she made Donovan better when she was around him. When Reginald decided she needed to be removed from the family because she asked too many questions and because she was too independent to be managed, I said nothing. Her voice dropped. "That is something I will carry for the rest of my life." I did not rush her. The cafe was warm and smelled of coffee and something baking in the back, and outside the window, New Canaan moved quietly through its morning as though the world were entirely ordinary. "The Cayman accounts," Constance said. "I have the access credentials for both entities. Not because Reginald gave them to me, he would never do that. But because 11 years ago I hired a private financial consultant to review our personal estate planning, and in the course of that review I became aware of the account structures Reginald had established. I wrote down what I found." She reached into her coat and placed a small sealed envelope on the table. "Everything is in there. Account numbers, access credentials, transaction summaries going back 9 years. 2 offshore entities registered in the Cayman Islands under shell company names, Westgate Holdings, LLC, and Meridian Asset Trust. Combined current balance as of last month is approximately $11.3 million. My breath moved slowly through my chest. 9.4 million in transfers we had already documented. 11.3 million sitting in offshore accounts. The numbers told a story of systematic and deliberate financial fraud spanning nearly a decade. "Constance," I said carefully, "why are you giving this to me?" She looked at me with those pale gray eyes, and for a moment something behind them broke open, not into tears, but into a raw and unguarded honesty that was in its own way more affecting than tears would have been. "Because I watched what happened at that dinner table," she said. "I watched Prescott call you what he called you, and I watched my husband point at the door and throw you out of your own daughter's home." Her voice did not waver, but it thinned at the edges. "And I thought that man came to Christmas dinner with a gift he wrapped himself. He wore an old coat, and he sat quietly, and he did not ask for anything from anyone. And they humiliated him anyway, because that is what this family does to people who don't perform the right kind of importance." She pressed her lips together for a moment. "I have been performing the right kind of importance for 35 years, Mr. Calloway. I am very tired." I looked at the envelope on the table between us. Under U.S. federal law, a cooperating witness who voluntarily provides evidence of financial crimes, particularly when that cooperation precedes any formal charges being filed, is eligible to negotiate a cooperation agreement with federal prosecutors that can substantially reduce or eliminate personal criminal liability. Solomon would need to move quickly to formalize Constance's cooperation before the FBI became directly involved and the leverage shifted. "I'm going to give you Solomon's direct number," I said. "He will protect you through this process. But you need to call him today, Constance. Not tomorrow. Today." She nodded once, a single firm movement. Then she picked up her mug and took a long, slow sip of coffee. Her knuckles, I noticed, were no longer white. "There is one more thing," she said. She set the mug down and looked at me steadily. "The church fund. The $3.8 million from Pastor Rhodes's community housing account. That was Prescott's idea, not Reginald's." She held my gaze. "Reginald knew. He approved it. But it was Prescott who identified the account, Prescott who structured the transfer, and Prescott who told the pastor it was a temporary administrative reallocation that would be reversed within 90 days. She paused. "It has been 14 months. The warmth of the cafe suddenly felt very far away. 14 months. Families in New Canaan who had applied for housing assistance and been told there were no funds available. People who had needed help and had been turned away because that money was sitting in Hargrove Corp's operating accounts, keeping Prescott's failing company breathing a little longer." I picked up the envelope and placed it carefully in my inside jacket pocket. "Thank you," I said, and I meant it in a way that went beyond the evidence she had just handed me. She nodded again and looked out the cafe window at the quiet New Canaan street, and I had the sense that she was seeing it differently than she had an hour ago, the way a room looks different when you finally open a window that has been painted shut for 35 years. I left her there, with her coffee, and walked out into the cold, my hand pressed against the inside of my jacket, where the envelope sat. Tomorrow, Pastor Calvin Rhodes was going to learn where his congregation's money had gone. Grace Fellowship Church sat on a quiet road in New Canaan, behind a row of old white oaks, a modest red brick building with a simple wooden cross above the entrance and a hand-painted sign near the parking lot that read, "All are welcome here." It was the kind of church that meant that sentence not as marketing, but as a daily operational fact. Grace Fellowship ran 4 active community programs, a food pantry, an after-school tutoring center, a winter coat drive, and a low-income housing assistance fund that helped working families in Fairfield County cover deposits and first-month rent when they had nowhere else to turn. That last program was the one Prescott had gutted. I arrived at 9 in the morning with Solomon beside me and FBI Special Agent Alistair Pemberton half a step behind. Pemberton was 48, supervising agent of the Financial Crimes Unit at the FBI's New Haven field office, lean, deliberate with close-cropped gray hair and the stillness of a man who had learned that the most important things happen when you stop talking and start watching. Pastor Calvin Rhodes met us at the side entrance. He was 60 years old, broad-faced, warm-eyed, with hands that looked like they had done genuine physical work before he found his calling. He had been told only that this meeting concerned the Community Housing Fund. He did not yet know what had happened to it. We sat in his small office behind the sanctuary. Pemberton opened a folder and spoke with the careful clarity of someone trained to deliver difficult information without letting the weight of it become theater. "Pastor Rhodes," he said, "your fund's account shows wire transfers totaling $3,800,000 executed over 14 months, directed into an operating account held by Hargrove Corp. In Stamford. These transfers were authorized using credentials belonging to your board member, Lawrence Greer, who also served as an outside consultant to Hargrove Corp." The color left Pastor Rhodes's face slowly, like light leaving a room as a cloud moves across the sun. His hands moved from his knees to grip the edge of the table. "That is everything we raised over 4 years," he said. His voice had dropped to almost nothing. "Every donation, every grant." He looked at Pemberton with eyes that were filling fast. "We have 47 families on our waiting list right now. We told them we had no funds available." His chest rose and fell hard. "We turned them away." "I'm sorry, Pastor," Pemberton said, simply honestly. Rhodes looked at me then, and in his eyes I saw the specific grinding pain of a man discovering that his congregation's trust had been used as a convenience by people who never once considered the families on the other end of it. "How do we get it back?" he asked, his voice cracking at the edge. "The misuse of a non-profit fund is a federal crime," Solomon said. "The FBI has jurisdiction. The offshore accounts are already identified and documented. Recovery proceedings move alongside the criminal case." Rhodes absorbed this. He sat for a long moment with his large hands flat on the table, staring at a child's drawing of a church pinned to his wall. Then something in his expression hardened into quiet, unshakable resolve. "Tell me what you need from me," he said. "Financial records for the past 2 years, Pemberton said. "A formal statement from you and your board. We handle everything else. You'll have it by this afternoon." He stood straight, despite everything shook each of our hands, and held mine a beat longer. "Mr. Calloway, I don't fully know your role in all of this, but I believe this church owes you something." "You don't owe me anything," I said. "Just make sure those 47 families get their calls returned." Something equal parts grief and determination moved across his face. He nodded once. Outside, Pemberton stopped beside his car. "Tomorrow I file the federal criminal complaint against both Hargroves. Arrest warrants by end of day. This becomes public very quickly after that." "I've been prepared since December 22nd, I said. He nodded, got in his car, and drove away. From inside the church came the faint sound of a volunteer moving boxes in the food pantry, working steadily, not yet knowing that justice and devastation had just shared the same small office on the same quiet morning. That evening I needed to see my daughter. She opened the door herself. I had not called ahead. I drove to the Greenwich house in the last gray light of the afternoon and parked the Buick in the driveway and sat there for 3 full minutes before I made myself get out. The Christmas wreath was still on the front door pine and gold ribbon, expensive and symmetrical, the kind of decoration selected for effect rather than feeling. The lights inside the house burned warm and steady, and somewhere behind those windows, my daughter was living inside a life that was about to change in ways she had not chosen and could not stop. I knocked. She opened the door, and the moment she saw me, Her face did something complicated, relief and guilt, and something close to fear, all moving through it at once, none of them landing cleanly before the next one arrived. She was wearing a gray sweater and no jewelry, her hair down, and without the green dress and the diamond earrings and the performance of the Christmas dinner, she looked younger and more exhausted than I had seen her in years. "Dad?" Her voice broke on the single syllable. Just that one word, and it broke. Can I come in?" I asked. She stepped back and let me through. We sat in a small sitting room off the main hallway, not the formal dining room, not any of the grand public spaces of the house, but a smaller room with a worn couch and a reading lamp and a bookshelf that held the kind of books that actually get read. It was the only room in the house that felt like someone actually lived in it. I noticed that immediately. Camille sat across from me with her hands pressed together between her knees, her shoulders curved inward slightly, the posture of someone bracing for impact. Her eyes were already bright with tears. She was working very hard not to release. "He's not here," she said. "Prescott. He's been at his father's house since yesterday. Since the—" She stopped. "Since everything." "I know," I said. She looked at me, then really looked the way you look at someone when the social scaffolding has come down and there is nothing left between you and the truth. "Dad, what is happening? Prescott won't tell me anything real. His father won't take my calls. I've been in this house for 3 days reading things on my laptop and not understanding half of it, and the other half is—" Her voice climbed, and she pressed her lips together hard to bring it back down. "The other half is terrifying." "I know," I said again. "That's why I'm here. I'm going to tell you everything, Camille. All of it. From the beginning." And I did. It took 40 minutes. I told her about Callaway Capital Partners, about the debt acquisition, about Solomon, and the court order, and the frozen accounts. I told her about Harriet Wynne, what Harriet had found inside Hargrove Corp., what had been done to her during the divorce, what 5 years of Reginald's legal machinery had cost her. I told her about the Cayman accounts and Constance's envelope and the $3.8 million from Pastor Rhodes's housing fund. I told her about Agent Pemberton and the federal criminal complaint that would be filed in the morning. And then I told her the part I had dreaded most, that Prescott had been using real estate assets held jointly in both their names as proposed collateral for a loan he had no capacity to repay. That her financial standing, her personal credit, her legally exposed assets had been placed at risk without her full and informed understanding of what she was signing. Through most of it, she was very still. But when I got to that last part, when I explained what Prescott had done with her name on those documents, something in her face crumpled. Not gradually. All at once, like a wall that holds and then simply does not hold anymore. "He put our house on the line," she said. Her voice was barely a sound. Without telling me what it actually meant. "The documents were structured to look like standard financial planning instruments," I said carefully. "The risk was buried in the terms. Solomon believes you signed without understanding the full exposure." "I signed—" She pressed both hands over her mouth. Her eyes filled completely and spilled over, tears running down her face in 2 straight lines, while the rest of her stayed very still, as though she were afraid that if she moved at all, she would stop being able to hold herself together. "I signed because he told me it was routine. He said it was just paperwork. He said—" A sob broke through, hard and sudden, the kind that comes from a place deep in the chest that has been compressed for a long time. "Oh God. Oh Dad." She bent forward, her face in her hands, and cried with the particular devastation of someone who is not only grieving what has happened, but simultaneously grieving every moment they chose not to see what was building toward it. I moved from my chair and sat beside her on the worn couch and put my arm around her shoulders the way I had done when she was 7 years old and had fallen off her bicycle on the sidewalk outside our house in New Haven. She turned into my shoulder and cried properly, then not the contained, careful crying of a woman in a green dress at a Christmas dinner, but the full, ragged, honest grief of my daughter, who had trusted someone she loved and had been used by that trust in ways that would take a long time to fully understand. I held on and said nothing, because some moments do not need words and cannot be improved by them. After a while, her breathing steadied. She sat up and wiped her face with the sleeve of her gray sweater and looked at me with eyes that were swollen and raw, and underneath all of that beginning to clear. "You knew," she said. "Before Christmas. You already knew what he was doing." "I knew enough," I said. "I needed to know all of it before I moved." She looked at her hands in her lap. "And at the dinner when they said those things to you." "I needed to look at them," I said. "I needed to see exactly who they were one more time before the process started. I needed to be certain." She was quiet for a moment. Then she lifted her face and looked at me with an expression I had not seen from her in years, not the careful, managed expression of the woman she had become in this house, but something older and more fundamental. The look of my daughter, who at 6 years old used to climb into my truck after school and tell me everything about her day before I had even started the engine. "Dad," she said, and her voice cracked again, but differently. This time not with grief, but with something that was trying very hard to become courage. "What do I do now?" I reached into my jacket pocket and placed Solomon's business card on the couch between us. "You call him first thing tomorrow morning, before Prescott comes back, before Reginald's attorneys can reach you." I looked at her steadily. "Solomon will protect your interests separately from everyone else in this. You are not liable for what Prescott did, Camille, but you need your own legal representation before tomorrow afternoon." She picked up the card and held it in both hands, as though it were something fragile. "Are you going to be okay?" I asked. She looked at me, and despite the swollen eyes and the tear-streaked face and the weight of everything pressing down on this quiet room, she straightened her spine by a fraction of an inch. "I don't know yet," she said honestly, "but I think I will be." That was enough. That was more than enough. I stayed another hour, and we talked not about lawyers or court orders or offshore accounts, but about small things, real things. About the music box I had brought to Christmas dinner that nobody had asked about. She asked me to describe it, and I did, and she listened with her whole face the way she used to listen when she was small, and the world was still a place where her father's voice could make things make sense. When I left, she walked me to the door and hugged me on the front step, tight, unself-conscious, real. "I'm sorry," she whispered against my shoulder, "for not saying anything that night." "I know," I said. "We'll get there, Camille." I walked back to the Buick in the dark. Behind me, I heard the front door close softly. Above the Greenwich rooftops, the winter sky was dense with cloud. No stars visible, the world pressed close and dark and very quiet. By morning, everything would be different. Before I tell you exactly what happened on the morning of New Year's Eve, comment 12 below, so I know who is still writing this out with me. Please note, portions of this story include fictional details crafted to bring the message to life. If you would prefer to stop here, the door is open, but for those staying, what comes next will be worth every second. The call came at 6:52 in the morning. I was already awake. I had not slept well, not from anxiety, but from the particular alertness of a man who knows that something large and irreversible is about to move through the world and finds it impossible to simply lie still while it does. I was dressed and sitting at the writing desk in my hotel room with a cup of coffee and the Hartford Courant open in front of me, not reading it when my phone lit up with Solomon's name. "Pemberton executed the warrants at 6:30, Solomon said. His voice was measured, but underneath the measure, there was a current of something, not excitement exactly, but the deep, steady satisfaction of a man who has spent 40 years believing that the law, when properly wielded, can still do what it was designed to do. 2 teams simultaneously, one at Hargrove Corp's Stamford offices, one at the Greenwich estate. I set my coffee cup down very carefully. Both of them. Both of them. Prescott was at the Stamford office. Apparently he had been sleeping there since the accounts were frozen running on whatever cash he had personally. Reginald was at the Greenwich house. A pause. Constance was also there, but she had already been formally designated a cooperating witness as of yesterday afternoon, so she was not detained. I thought about Constance in that wingback chair by the window on Christmas Day, asking quietly how much I knew. 35 years of watching. 35 years of performing the right kind of importance. And then one morning in a New Canaan cafe, setting a sealed envelope on a table and letting go of all of it. How did Prescott take it? I asked. Solomon cleared his throat. Pemberton's words were, and I am reading this from a text he sent me at 7:15, subject Prescott Hargrove, became verbally combative upon presentation of the warrant, demanded to speak with Gerald Fitch before any communication, and had to be physically steadied by 2 agents when his legs gave out as the handcuffs were applied. I stared at the wall of my hotel room for a moment. Prescott Hargrove, who had raised a glass at his Christmas dinner table and called me uneducated trash with the absolute confidence of a man who had never once been held accountable for anything, standing in his own office on New Year's Eve, with his legs failing beneath him, while 2 federal agents held him upright. "And Reginald?" I asked. "Still and quiet," Solomon said. Pemberton said he walked out of the house under his own power without saying a single word. Didn't ask for his attorney, didn't make any statements, didn't look at the agents, just walked to the car. A brief pause, which in some ways is more frightening than Prescott's reaction. A man like Reginald Hargrove goes quiet when he's calculating, not when he's defeated. "He's not defeated yet," I said. "No," Solomon agreed. "But he's charged, which is a start." The federal charges, as Pemberton had outlined them the previous afternoon, were substantial. Prescott faced 3 counts of wire fraud, the use of electronic communications to execute a fraudulent financial scheme, 2 counts of conspiracy to commit financial fraud, and 1 count of misappropriation of funds from a federally tax-exempt nonprofit organization, which carried a maximum sentence of 10 years under federal statute. Reginald faced the same wire fraud and conspiracy charges, with an additional count related to his role in authorizing the offshore transfer structure. Lawrence Greer, the board member who had used his signatory access to redirect the church fund, had been contacted by Pemberton's team the previous evening and had, according to Solomon, cooperated immediately and completely, providing a full written statement before midnight. My phone buzzed with a second call while Solomon was still speaking. I recognized Pemberton's number. "Agent Pemberton is calling me now," I told Solomon. "I'll call you back." I switched lines. "Mr. Calloway." Pemberton's voice was brisk and professional, but underneath it ran the particular energy of a man in the middle of a significant mourning. "I wanted to update you directly. Both subjects are in federal custody and will be processed at the New Haven field office. Initial appearance before a federal magistrate is scheduled for 2 o'clock this afternoon. Given the weight of the documentary evidence and the cooperation of 2 material witnesses, I expect the magistrate to deny bail for Prescott and set a substantial bond for Reginald, pending a full bail hearing next week." "Thank you, Agent Pemberton," I said. "There is one development I want to flag for you," he continued. "When our team arrived at the Stamford office this morning, Prescott's personal assistant, a woman named Diane Colby, 12 years with the company, voluntarily handed our agents a second set of internal financial records that she had been maintaining separately from the official company files. She told our agents she had been keeping them for, quote, when this day finally came." He paused. "The records include communications between Prescott and Lawrence Greer that explicitly discuss the church fund transfers as a, quote, temporary bridge solution that Rhodes will never audit. That phrase will be in the federal record." I pressed my hand flat against the desk in front of me. 12 years Diane Colby had worked for that man. 12 years, and she had been quietly keeping a second set of books, waiting for someone to arrive at the door with a warrant. How many people knew? I said, mostly to myself. More than Prescott believed, Pemberton said. That is frequently the case. He cleared his throat. One more thing. The media. I cannot control when this becomes public, and given the processing timeline, I expect it will be reportable by noon at the latest. I wanted you to have time to inform anyone who needs to know before they read it elsewhere. Camille. Understood, I said. Thank you. I ended the call and immediately dialed my daughter. She answered on the first ring, which told me she had been awake and waiting the phone close. Camille, I said. It happened this morning. Both of them. I need you to call Solomon right now before anything appears online. He's expecting your call. A sound came through the phone that was not quite a word, a short, sharp exhale, the sound of someone absorbing a blow they knew was coming, but that still lands with its full weight regardless. Then her voice came back steadier than I expected. Okay, she said. Okay, Dad. I'm calling him now. Are you all right? A pause. I will be, she said. I meant it last night. I held the phone for a moment after she hung up, sitting in the quiet of my hotel room on the last morning of the year. Outside the window, the road through Washington was just beginning to move, with the ordinary traffic of an ordinary New Year's Eve morning, people running errands, picking up party supplies, making plans for midnight that had nothing to do with federal warrants or frozen accounts or $43 million in distressed debt. The world continued its business entirely unaware. I picked up the Hartford Courant again, and this time I actually read it. I had time now. The part of this that belonged to me had been done with care and patience over many months, and it had moved exactly as it should. What came next belonged to the courts, to Pemberton's investigators, to Solomon's legal arguments, and to the slow, grinding machinery of accountability that I had spent my adult life believing in, even when it gave me very little reason to. I finished my coffee. I ordered breakfast. I watched the last morning of 2024 move past my window like any other morning, somewhere across the state in a federal processing facility in New Haven. Prescott. Hargrove was sitting in a room that had no Christmas tree, no crystal glasses, no audience arranged to reflect his own importance back at him. Just walls, and the particular silence of a man finally alone with what he has done. The federal courthouse in New Haven is a serious building, not intimidating in the theatrical sense, not designed to crush you with grandeur, the way some older courthouses are with their marble columns and vaulted ceilings built to make ordinary people feel small. This building is serious in a quieter, more honest way. Clean lines, good light, the efficient architecture of an institution that has work to do and does not require decoration to remind anyone of that fact. I had been inside it twice before in my life, both times on civil matters related to Callaway Capital Partners. Both times I had walked out with what I came for. I arrived at 1:30 and took a seat in the public gallery of Courtroom 4 on the third floor, third row from the back. Solomon sat beside me in his good charcoal suit, a legal pad balanced on one knee. The room was not full, but it was not empty either. 2 reporters with press credentials sat in the designated media section. Gerald Fitch was at the defense table, flanked by a younger associate I did not recognize. A federal prosecutor named Catherine Waverly, 35 years old, precise and unhurried in a dark navy suit, sat at the government's table reviewing documents with the focused calm of someone who has done this many times and finds it neither thrilling nor routine but simply necessary. They brought Prescott in first. He had been processed and changed into civilian clothes, a plain dark shirt, no tie, no cufflinks, none of the careful assembly of presents that he wore like a second skin in his ordinary life. Without it, he looked smaller. Not physically, he was still the same broad-shouldered, square-jawed man who had filled the head of his dining table 7 days ago. But something load-bearing in his presentation had been removed, and what remained was a man who looked for the first time in my experience of him genuinely frightened. He did not look at the gallery when he entered. He kept his eyes on the defense table and sat down beside Fitch and bent his head toward his attorney, immediately speaking in a rapid, low undertone. Fitch placed a steadying hand briefly on his arm and said something short and firm that I could not hear, but recognized by its effect. Prescott stopped talking and sat back and pressed both hands flat on the table in front of him. Reginald was brought in 3 minutes later. True to Solomon's report from that morning, he was composed. He walked to the defense table with his shoulders level and his chin up, and he sat down without speaking to anyone. He did not look at Prescott. He did not look at Fitch. He sat and looked directly at the empty bench where the magistrate would shortly appear with the expression of a man who has decided that the only remaining form of dignity available to him is stillness. Then I saw something I had not expected. In the row directly behind the defense table, the first row of public seating on the defense side of the courtroom, a man sat alone. He was tall, broad across the shoulders like Reginald, with the same strong jaw as Prescott, but carrying it differently without the performance. He wore a plain gray suit and held his hands loosely in his lap and stared at the back of his father's head with an expression I could not immediately name. Donovan Hargrove. He had not been mentioned in any of the morning's communications. He had simply appeared the way people appear at the worst moments of their families' lives. Because regardless of everything, it is still their family. And the pull of that is not always rational or fair or even wanted. He must have felt me looking, because he turned his head slightly, and for a brief moment our eyes met across the courtroom. I held his gaze without hostility and without warmth, simply with the acknowledgement of two people who know more about each other than they have ever directly said. He looked away first. Federal Magistrate Judge Dorothy Hale entered at 2 o'clock precisely, and the room rose and settled. She was 60 years old, small and upright behind the bench with reading glasses on a chain around her neck, and the brisk, unimpressed manner of a judge who has heard every version of every story and is interested only in the facts in front of her today. United States versus Prescott Hargrove and Reginald Hargrove, she said, opening the file before her. Initial appearance on federal charges including wire fraud conspiracy to commit financial fraud and misappropriation of funds from a federally tax-exempt organization. She looked over her glasses at the defense table. Counsel, your clients have reviewed the charges. They have, Your Honor, Fitch said. Mr. Hargrove. She looked at Prescott. You understand the charges as read. Prescott stood. His voice came out strained and thin. Yes, Your Honor. Mr. Hargrove. She shifted her attention to Reginald. He stood without haste. Yes, Your Honor, he said. His voice was exactly as I remembered it from Christmas Eve, deep-controlled, the voice of a man who had spent 65 years being certain of his own authority. But in this room, that voice carried no weight at all. Judge Hale had heard better and was unmoved. Prosecutor Waverly rose and addressed the bail question directly and without theater. She outlined the evidentiary record, the documented offshore transfers, the cooperating witnesses, the nonprofit fund, misappropriation, and requested that Prescott be remanded without bail, pending trial, citing flight risk, given the offshore account access and the scale of the fraud. For Reginald, she requested a $5 million cash bond. Fitch argued carefully and at length. He cited Prescott's community ties, his family responsibilities, his lack of prior criminal record. Judge Hale listened with the expression of someone who is being thorough, because thoroughness is required, not because she is undecided. She denied bail for Prescott. The sound Prescott made when she said it was not a word. It was a short, involuntary sound from somewhere in his chest, shock, compressed into a single exhale, the sound of a man whose body reacted before his mind could stop it. Fitch put a hand on his arm again. Prescott gripped the edge of the table and his knuckles went white, and his jaw worked silently for a moment before he brought himself back under control. Reginald's bond was set at $5 million. He nodded once at the number as though confirming an appointment time. As the magistrate closed the proceeding and the room began to move, I watched Donovan Hargrove in the row ahead of me. He had not moved through any of it, not when Prescott made that sound, not when the bail was denied, not when the magistrate's gavel came down. He sat with his hands in his lap and his eyes straight ahead, and on his face was the expression I had been unable to name when I first saw him. I could name it now. It was grief not for what was happening to his father and his brother, but for the fact that none of it surprised him. The grief of a man who has known for a very long time what the people he loves are capable of, and has spent years hoping he was wrong, and has just been proven definitively right in a federal courtroom on the last afternoon of the year. As people filed out around him, Donovan Hargrove remained seated. I paused at the end of his row on my way out. I did not know why. Some impulse I could not entirely account for. He looked up at me. His eyes were dark and steady and exhausted. "Mr. Calloway," he said quietly. "Mr. Hargrove," I said. We looked at each other for a moment, across everything that had happened, and everything that connected us, and everything that stood between us. "I owe someone an apology," he said. "Several someones." I thought of Harriet in Bushnell Park, her hands white around her coffee cup, her spine straight against 5 years of damage. "Yes," I said simply, "you do." I walked out into the corridor and left him sitting there in the emptying courtroom with the weight of that truth and whatever he chose to do with it. Outside, the afternoon light over New Haven was already thinning toward dark. In a few hours, the city would light up for New Year's Eve, and people would count down and make resolutions and believe the way people always believe at midnight, that the turning of a number changes something fundamental. For the Hargrove family, the number had already turned, and there was still one more thing I needed to do. I drove back to New Haven, not to the Mayflower Inn, not to any hotel with clean sheets and a writing desk, and the careful distance of temporary accommodation. I drove to the city itself, to the specific neighborhood, near the old freight yard on the eastern edge of downtown, where I had spent the first decade of my working life loading freight before sunrise for what felt like wages no one could actually live on. Learning what my body could endure while my mind quietly built something else entirely in the background. I parked on a side street 2 blocks from where the loading dock entrance used to be and sat for a moment looking at the building that had replaced it. A mixed-use residential complex, now clean brick modern windows, a coffee shop on the ground floor, where the freight supervisor's office once stood. The city had changed. 40 years changes everything that isn't built from something stronger than concrete. I got out and walked. New Haven on New Year's Eve carried that particular energy of a city, simultaneously winding down and winding up. Restaurants bright behind fogged windows, a group of students moving noisily along the sidewalk wrapped in coats and scarves, someone's car stereo trailing music down a cross street and disappearing. I walked without a destination for 20 minutes, hands deep in my coat pockets, breathing the cold air, letting the city move around me while I stayed still inside it. I thought about my father. He had come to New Haven from rural Virginia in 1959 with $30 and a pair of work boots, and he had spent his entire life in this state, doing honest, unacknowledged work and asking nothing from anyone except the space to keep doing it. He died in 1991 before Callaway Capital Partners had grown into anything worth the name. But he left me something more durable than money. The understanding that a man's worth is not located in what others can see from across a room, and that patience applied with intelligence is the most powerful instrument a person of modest origin can possess. A text from Solomon arrived at 7:15. Reginald's attorneys posted bond at 6 p.m. He's out pending trial. Don't let it concern you. The evidentiary record is too complete for Bond to change anything. I typed back, "It doesn't concern me. Are you home?" His reply came immediately, "Diner on Wally. Back booth. Coffee is still cheap." I laughed out loud alone on a sidewalk in New Haven, a real laugh unguarded rising briefly into the cold air before the night swallowed it. Solomon Brief, 70 years old, Yale law graduate, senior partner of a midtown Manhattan firm, sitting in the same back booth of the same diner on Wally Avenue where two young men had kept warm over cheap coffee 40 years ago, because it was the only warmth they could afford. I walked the 6 blocks and went inside. The diner had been renovated twice since 1984, but retained through some miracle of stubborn institutional memory. The same essential geography, the same long counter, the same row of booths along the window wall, the same smell of coffee and griddle grease. Solomon was in the back booth exactly as promised, his charcoal jacket folded beside him, his reading glasses on the table, both hands around a mug of coffee. He looked up when I slid into the seat across from him and smiled. Not the small, controlled expression he deployed in professional settings, but the full, unguarded smile of an old friend in a place that remembered them both. "You look tired," he said. "I feel fine," I told him. "Those are not mutually exclusive." He signaled the server without looking up, and another mug appeared before me almost instantly. We talked about everything except the case. Solomon's granddaughter just accepted to Georgetown. A fishing trip to Maine we had been planning and not taking for 11 years. Whether the coffee here had genuinely improved, or whether 40 years of loyalty had simply recalibrated our expectations to the point where anything warm tasted like excellence. It was nearly 9 o'clock when the door opened and Donovan Hargrove walked in. He stood at the entrance, located us in the back booth, and walked over with the careful deliberateness of a man who has made a decision and is committed to seeing it through regardless of the cost. He stopped at the end of our booth, hands at his sides, and looked at me directly. "I needed to say something I should have said a long time ago," he said. "I didn't want to wait any longer." He took a breath. "What my father did to you at that dinner, what Prescott did. I have watched this family do that to people my entire life and said nothing. Harriet paid for my silence. Others paid for it in rooms I was never in." His voice tightened at the edges but held firm. "I have no defense for that." "What are you asking for?" I said. "Nothing from you," he said quietly. "I contacted Harriet this afternoon. She didn't hang up." Something shifted in my chest, the recognition of a man doing the hardest and least celebrated kind of right thing, the kind with no audience and no reward, done entirely because it is owed. "Good," I said. "Keep doing that." He nodded once, buttoned his coat, and walked back out into the New Haven night. Solomon watched him go, then looked back at his coffee with the expression of a man quietly revising a judgment he had already formed. At midnight, without ceremony or countdown, we raised our mugs across the worn table. "To 43 million reasons," Solomon said. "To the 47 families on Pastor Rhodes's list," I said. Outside on Wally Avenue, the city made its midnight noise, distant fireworks, a car horn, someone shouting something joyful into the winter dark. I drove home to Litchfield at 1 in the morning, the highway empty and clean with recent snow. Tomorrow, the real work of rebuilding would begin. The first week of January moved differently than December had. December had been a month of precision and controlled pressure every day, carrying the specific weight of something building toward rupture. January felt wider. Not easier, not without its own demands, but wider in the way that open ground feels wide after weeks of navigating something narrow and dangerous. The legal machinery was running now under its own momentum, supervised by Pemberton's investigators and Solomon's firm, and what remained for me was the slower, less dramatic work of ensuring the consequences reached the people they were meant to reach. Solomon called on the 2nd of January. "The Cayman accounts are frozen," he said. Westgate Holdings and Meridian Asset Trust combined balance $11.3 million locked by federal court order issued in cooperation with the Cayman Islands Financial Authority. It doesn't mean recovery yet. That process runs parallel to the criminal case and takes time. But frozen means immovable, and immovable means Reginald cannot touch it. And the church fund, I asked, most straightforward component of the entire case. 3.8 million clearly documented, directly traceable through Harriet's records and Lawrence Greer's full cooperation. Pemberton estimates a civil restitution order within 60 days. I thought about 60 days. I thought about 47 families on a waiting list. I thought about a Connecticut January and deposit checks that didn't exist, and first-month rent that couldn't be covered. Draw up the paperwork, I said. Callaway Capital Partners will advance the $3.8 million to Grace Fellowship immediately. Documented loan basis repaid from the restitution order when it comes through. A pause on the line, brief and controlled, the pause of a man who does not make his emotions other people's business. Then Solomon said, "I'll have it ready by end of day." I drove to New Canaan the following morning. Pastor Rhodes was at his desk reviewing a spreadsheet of waiting list applications when I arrived. His reading glasses were low on his nose and his coffee had gone cold beside him. Untouched the way coffee goes cold, when a person is too absorbed in what they are reading to remember it exists. I sat across from him and explained what was happening, that the funds would reach Grace Fellowship's account within 48 hours, that the families on his list could begin receiving assistance immediately. He put both hands over his face. He sat like that for a long moment, shoulders rising and falling, with the unsteady rhythm of a man holding himself together with everything he has. When he finally lowered his hands, his eyes were wet, and his jaw was set with the expression of someone feeling grief and relief. Simultaneously, two enormous things arriving at the same moment from opposite directions, colliding somewhere in the middle of his chest. "Mr. Callaway." His voice came out rough and full. 31 years I have been a pastor. I have learned not to specify the method when I ask God for something. He looked at me with those warm, direct eyes. I did not expect the method to be a 68-year-old man with a wooden music box and a private investment fund. I laughed a real laugh, unguarded and genuine. "Neither did I admitted. He stood and took my hand in both of his, and his grip was so warm and so firm that I felt it travel all the way up my arm. Camille called on the 8th of January. She had been meeting with Solomon every other day, working through the legal process of separating her financial exposure from Prescott's. Patricia Voss, her own attorney, whom Solomon had described as terrifying, and meant it as the highest compliment, had confirmed that Camille bore no legal liability for Prescott's debts. The documents had been deliberately complex. The risk had been deliberately buried. She had signed without understanding what she was signing, and that distinction mattered enormously under the law. But that was not why she was calling. "Dad," she said. Her voice had changed since the night on the worn couch in Greenwich. Steadier, cleaner. "I went back to the house today to get my things." A pause. "I'm moving out." "Where are you going?" I kept my voice easy. "West Hartford. Small apartment, 3rd floor, 2 windows that look out at someone else's building." Another pause, and then something happened in her voice that caught me completely unprepared. She laughed. Short, bright, slightly disbelieving. "It's the first place I have chosen entirely by myself in 6 years, Dad. The kitchen is terrible and I love it completely." Something moved through my chest, too large and too warm to name properly. I pressed my free hand flat against my knee and breathed through it carefully. "That sounds exactly right," I said. Harriet called on the 11th. She was brief as always, but lighter, a quality of relief in her voice, like barometric pressure finally lifting after a long storm. "Solomon told me about the church fund advance," she said. "I wanted to say thank you, not for me, for those families." You made it possible, I said. 5 years of keeping those records. That is what moved everything, Harriet. A pause. Donovan called again, she said quietly. 3 times this week. I waited, giving her the space to finish. I don't know yet, she said, but I'm answering the phone. A short breath. That's something. It is, I said. It genuinely is. On the 14th of January, I settled my bill at the Mayflower Inn, shook Walter Foss's hand, and drove 2 hours back to my house in Litchfield. Walking through my front door, I felt the specific relief of a man returning to a space entirely his own, not grand, not arranged for anyone's approval, simply honest. On the kitchen table sat the craftsman's receipt for the wooden music box I had bought in December. I picked it up, looked at it for a moment, and placed it in the drawer beside the stove where I keep things worth remembering. Then I put the kettle on and stood in my kitchen and listened to the water begin to heat. Outside, the January hillside stood bare and cold and entirely unconcerned with everything that had happened. There was still a trial to come, still months of legal proceedings and testimony ahead, but something had already been decided that no future court date could touch or undo. The kettle whistled. I made my tea, sat down, and let the quiet of my own house settle around me like something long and honestly earned. 9 months is a long time to wait for something you already know is coming. The federal trial of Prescott and Reginald Hargrove opened on the 8th of September, 2025. I had known the date since March, when Judge Hale set the trial calendar, after Gerald Fitch's series of pretrial motions, each one ambitious, each one denied. He had tried to suppress Harriet's documents on chain of custody grounds. He had challenged Constance's cooperation agreement as prosecutorially coerced. He had moved to sever the church fund charges from the fraud charges on prejudice grounds. Judge Hale's written denial of all 3 was, according to Solomon, a masterpiece of judicial understatement. I drove to New Haven on the morning of September 8th and took my seat in the gallery of Courtroom 4 for the second time. The room felt different at trial. Fuller, more charged, carrying the atmospheric weight of something that had been building toward itself for months and had finally irreversibly arrived. The jury, 8 women and 4 men, ages ranging from mid-20s to late 60s, sat in the jury box with the careful neutrality of ordinary people suddenly placed at the center of something consequential. Prescott had lost weight since December. His jaw was still strong, his suit still precise, but his eyes had changed. The flat certainty of Christmas Eve, replaced by something that moved and shifted and could not find a place to settle. He watched everything. The jury, the judge, the door, the prosecution table, back to the jury again. Reginald sat beside him unchanged, still upright, still composed, still performing the authority of a man who believes that bearing matters more than outcome. Prosecutor Waverly's opening statement was 22 minutes of methodical devastation. She laid out the full architecture of the fraud in plain, accessible language: offshore transfers, church fund, misappropriation, financial risk, deliberately buried in documents, signed by an unknowing spouse, building it piece by piece, each element supporting everything that followed. Fitch's opening was 40 minutes of considerable skill, arguing that what Waverly called fraud was aggressive but legal financial decision-making under business pressure, that the offshore accounts were legitimate tax planning, that the church fund transfers were authorized by an independent board member acting without full leadership knowledge. The jury listened to both with the careful, slightly furrowed attention of people trying very hard to be fair. Harriet took the stand on the 3rd day. She wore dark blue and sat with her spine straight and her hands folded, and she looked at Waverly with the clear attention of a woman who has been waiting for this moment for a very long time and intends to use every second of it precisely. She walked through the financial discrepancies, the internal transfer records, the conversations with the CFO, when she raised her concerns, the sequence of events leading to her termination. Her voice never wavered. Every answer was measured and complete. Then Fitch rose for cross-examination. He was skilled. He challenged her analytical methodology. He questioned her understanding of corporate treasury management. And then carefully, without quite saying it directly, he implied that her cooperation was rooted in personal bitterness, a failed marriage to a Hargrove family member, rather than genuine concern for financial integrity. Harriet looked at him. She did not flinch. She did not color. She tilted her head very slightly and said in a voice that reached every corner of the courtroom without effort, "I kept those records for 2 years before my divorce was finalized. They existed before I had any personal grievance with this family. The timeline is in the documentation." From 3 rows behind me, someone drew a sharp, involuntary breath. Fitch moved on. Constance took the stand on the 5th day. She walked to the witness box with her silver hair and 35 years of practiced composure, and she sat down and answered every question with the quiet authority of a woman who has finally irrevocably stopped performing anything at all. When Waverly asked why she had maintained the Cayman credentials for 11 years without reporting them, Constance looked directly at the jury and said, "Because I was afraid. I had watched what this family did to people who challenged it. I believed my security depended on my silence." She paused and her voice thinned slightly but held. "I was wrong. The security was never real, and the silence cost other people things that had nothing to do with me." The jury box went very still. Fitch's cross-examination of Constance lasted 90 minutes. It was aggressive and thorough, and ultimately unable to find purchase on anything she said, because everything she said was documented, corroborated, and delivered by a woman whose credibility was reinforced rather than undermined by the evident personal cost of telling the truth. At the end of the 5th day, Solomon and I walked out into the September evening together, the air warm and golden, in the way New England air is golden for exactly 2 weeks before autumn takes it away permanently. "How long for deliberations?" I asked. 3 days, maybe 4. He looked at me over his glasses. "Eugene, I have practiced law for 40 years. I know better than to make guarantees. But I will tell you this, I have not seen a stronger evidentiary record in a federal fraud case in the last decade." I nodded and looked up at the September sky over New Haven going slowly amber at the edges. "Solomon," I said, "whatever happens in that jury room, Harriet testified. Constance testified. Those 47 families have their money back." I paused. "Some of what needed to happen has already happened." He put his hand briefly on my shoulder, a gesture he had made exactly twice in 40 years of friendship, both times when words were not enough. "Go home, Eugene," he said. "I'll call you when the jury comes back." I drove home through the golden September evening with the windows down. In 4 days, everything would reach its conclusion. Solomon called at 11:47 on the 4th day. While I was in my workshop in Litchfield, sanding the edge of a walnut shelf I had been building since August. I had sanded the same edge 6 times that morning. I was not, I will admit, entirely present in the workshop. "The jury is back," Solomon said. My hand tightened on the phone. "How long did it take?" 3 days, 14 hours. The foreperson asked the judge a clarifying question on day 2 about the legal definition of conspiracy. A pause. "That is not the question of a jury struggling with guilt. That is the question of a jury making sure they apply the right charge to something they have already decided." I was in my car 8 minutes later. Solomon texted at 12:40 courtroom 4. 1 p.m. "Camille is here." That last sentence stopped my breath. Camille had not attended any of the trial. Her attorney, Patricia Voss, had advised distance, while her civil case remained pending. But she had come for the verdict. She had decided entirely on her own that she needed to be in that room for this moment. I walked into courtroom 4 at 12:53. Every seat in the gallery was taken. I found Solomon near the center and sat beside him. 3 rows ahead, I spotted the back of Camille's head, her dark hair down her shoulders, set with the particular determination of a woman who has decided to face something fully, rather than hear about it later from a safe distance. Harriet sat 2 seats from her. They had begun meeting for coffee in the months since January 2, women damaged by the same structure, finding in each other the companionship of people who never need to explain themselves, because everything is already understood. Constance sat alone in the far corner of the gallery, dressed in charcoal gray hands, folded eyes forward. Donovan sat 3 rows behind her. He had attended every single day of the trial. Prescott looked like a man who had not slept in 4 days. His hands on the defense table pressed flat against the wood, as though it were the only solid thing remaining in the room, and he was terrified of what would happen if he let go. His eyes moved too quickly. Jury box judge's bench door back to jury, the restless scanning of a person whose body has understood something the mind is still refusing to accept. Reginald sat beside him still and upright, performing composure to the last possible moment. But today his stillness had lost its quality of calculated control. It had become the stillness of a man who has run out of moves and is simply waiting for the board to be cleared. Judge Hale entered. The room rose. The room sat. The foreperson, a woman in her 50s with reading glasses and deliberate manner, stood and looked at the paper in her hands. On the charge of wire fraud count 1, the jury find the defendant, Prescott Hargrove, guilty. Prescott's hands curled inward, suddenly fingers folding against his palms. His shoulders dropped by a fraction of an inch, barely visible, entirely unmistakable. On the charge of wire fraud count 2, guilty. On the charge of wire fraud count 3, guilty. Each count landed in the room like something physical. Not loud, not dramatic, just steady and irresistible, the way water moves when it has found its level, and nothing remains to stop it. On the charge of conspiracy to commit financial fraud, guilty. Prescott made a sound. Low, involuntary, barely audible beyond the first 2 rows, a sound from the bottom of the chest, with no word attached to it. The sound of a man whose last internal structure has finally given way. He pressed both hands over his face, and his shoulders shook once hard, before he pulled himself back with visible effort, and sat motionless with his face covered. 3 rows ahead of me, Camille's spine stiffened, and then released a single small movement, like a breath held for 9 months, finally completely let go. Her head dropped forward, and her hand moved to her mouth. Harriet reached over and placed her hand on Camille's arm. Camille covered it immediately with her own, and held on tightly, the grip of someone who needs an anchor and has found one. On the charge of misappropriation of funds from a federally tax-exempt organization, guilty. The foreperson moved to Reginald's charges. Reginald did not move through any of it. Not at the first count, not at the conspiracy charge, not at any of the others. He sat with his hands flat on the table, and his jaw set, and his eyes fixed somewhere beyond the room itself, the expression of a man who has decided that if he does not visibly react, the words being spoken will somehow be less than fully real. They were fully real. When the final count was read, and the foreperson sat down, the room erupted, not with theatrical noise, but with the release of 9 months of compressed human tension, finding its outlet simultaneously. 60 people exhaling at once, chairs shifting, voices low and urgent, the particular sound of a room that has been holding its breath for a very long time. In the far corner, Constance Hargrove closed her eyes. Her lips moved slightly, prayer or gratitude or the private acknowledgement of something finally irrevocably finished. Donovan sat completely still, staring at the back of his father's head, with the expression I had finally learned to name in the New Haven courthouse 9 months ago, the grief of a man who has known for years what the people he loves are capable of, and has just been proven right in the most public room imaginable. Just before the side door closed behind Reginald, he turned his head slightly. His eyes found me in the gallery. I looked back at him steadily. I did not look away. Then the door closed, and he was gone. Solomon and I walked out into the September afternoon together. The sunlight over New Haven was warm and clean and entirely indifferent to everything that had just happened inside that building, which was, I thought, exactly as it should be. The world does not stop for justice. It simply continues a little straighter than it was before. Sentencing was scheduled for the 15th of December, 2025. Exactly 1 year minus 9 days from the evening, I had driven up the long Belgian brick driveway of the Hargrove estate, with a wrapped wooden music box on my passenger seat and a navy shirt with a missing button. I noticed the near anniversary when Solomon sent the scheduling notice in October, and I noticed it again on the morning I drove to New Haven through a December that smelled identical to the December before pine and cold air, and the particular stillness of a Connecticut winter that has finally decided to mean it. Courtroom 4 felt different for the third time, quieter than the verdict, less charged with the electric uncertainty of an unknown outcome. The room carried instead the specific gravity of a proceeding whose conclusion is already established and whose only remaining task is the formal, irreversible inscription of consequences into the public record. Prescott had been in federal custody since September. He wore prison-issued clothing, and without the careful assembly of his professional appearance, he looked younger somehow, and smaller, and more ordinary than I had ever seen him. He sat with his eyes mostly downcast, and when he did look up, it was at the middle distance between himself and everything else, the gaze of a man who has spent 3 months in a very small room, with nothing to examine but the architecture of his own decisions. Reginald sat beside him, still upright, still performing dignity. But his face in the December light looked older than it had in September. Composure carried a cost, and the cost had become visible. Judge Hale sentenced Prescott to 11 years in federal prison on the combined fraud and misappropriation charges, with full restitution ordered for the church fund and remaining civil claims. Reginald received 8 years with restitution covering his portion of the offshore asset recovery. Both sentences were delivered in Judge Hale's characteristic voice, brisk, unimpressed, the voice of a judge who understands that gravity does not require theater. When Hale read Prescott's sentence, he closed his eyes. He kept them closed for a long moment. He was 39 years old. He would be 50 when he walked out. Those were the facts, clean and sufficient. When Hale read Reginald's sentence, he nodded once, precise, controlled, as though confirming an appointment time. Then he looked straight ahead and did not move again. The gavel came down for the last time. Camille was waiting in the corridor outside. She stood near the window at the end of the hall, the December light catching the silver that had begun threading through her dark hair over this past year, the year that had aged her in some ways and restored her completely in others. She wore a deep burgundy wool coat I had never seen before, entirely her own choice, and she stood the way she had learned to stand again across these 12 months straight, easy, occupying exactly as much space as she needed without apology. She crossed to me when I came through the door and put her arms around me without saying anything first. She held on with the full, uncomplicated grip of a daughter holding her father, and I held her back with both arms and felt the entire year compressed into that single point of contact. "Thank you, Dad," she said against my shoulder. Her voice was thick and warm. Not just for the legal part, for coming to that dinner, for not disappearing afterward. She pulled back and looked at me with bright, wet eyes and a jaw set with quiet determination. For not giving up on me when I gave you every reason to. My throat tightened in a way I had not anticipated. I pressed my hand briefly against her cheek, and she leaned into it for just a moment before straightening. "You're my daughter," I said. "There is no version of this where I give up on you." She nodded, holding herself together with the practiced steadiness of someone who has gotten very good at it this year. Then she smiled, not the Christmas dinner smile, not the surface smile, but the real one. The one I remembered from the truck on the way home from my shifts, her head against the window, everything still ahead. I reached into my jacket pocket and placed the wooden music box in her hands. She turned it over, slowly running her thumb along the carved edge. She opened the small lid, and the mechanism played 8 bars of a simple, clean melody music that did not try to be more than it was. Her chin trembled. She pressed her lips together hard and looked up at me with eyes full to the edge. "It's beautiful, Dad," she whispered. "It's the most beautiful thing." "It was always for you," I said. "It just took a year to get there." Solomon appeared at my elbow. Harriet and Camille exchanged the look of people who have survived the same fire from different angles and found on the other side something resembling real friendship. Pastor Rhodes shook my hand, with both of his eyes warm and full. Donovan gave me a single nod from across the corridor that carried everything said in the New Haven diner and everything that had happened since. Constance approached last quiet and unhurried and said simply, "Thank you for letting me make it right." "You made it right yourself," I told her. "I just opened the door." I drove home to Litchfield as the last December light went deep amber over the Connecticut hillside. I pulled into my driveway and sat for a moment looking at my house, modest, honest, entirely mine. Inside, I put the kettle on and stood in my kitchen while the water heated. On the table, where the music box had sat for a year, there was now only the grain of the wood and the quiet of a house glad to have me back. It was enough. It was in every way that mattered exactly enough. People ask what this story is really about. A court order 43 opsos. No, it was never about any of that. It was about a man told for 67 years he did not belong in the room, who chose quietly to build something patient enough to outlast everyone who ever pointed at the door. I am not a perfect man. I let distance grow where presence was needed. Do not do what I did. Show the people you love that you see them on an ordinary Tuesday. That is the real family story nobody talks about enough. I believe God does not waste suffering. He composted mine into something that fed other people. That is the Grandpa Stories kind of truth. It does not arrive loudly. You only notice at some point that the darkness is gone. My personal opinion: dignity is not given by the room you stand in. It is what you carry into the room, regardless of who tries to take it. This family story was built from patience, pain, and the stubborn belief that doing the right thing completely and carefully is always worth it. Every Grandpa Stories lesson I know came from living slowly and watching closely. If this moved you, comment below, share with someone who needs it, and subscribe. More stories are coming. Thank you for staying with me to the very end of this Grandpa Stories journey. Warning: stories ahead contain fictional elements for educational purposes. If that is not for you, step away freely and find content that fits. For everyone staying, see you in the next family story.